Victorian England was a place where gaslight flickered against fog-damp walls, where the carriages of gentlemen rattled down cobblestone streets on their way to parlors of marble and velvet, while just around the corner stood women whose names would never be recorded, faces illuminated not by chandeliers, but by the dim glow of street lamps, waiting for strangers in the night, and though official history draped itself in progress and morality. This other story, the story of prostitution, lingered like a ghost in the alleys, whispered about but never spoken of openly, for thousands of women lived this life in silence, while the city pretended not to see. And tonight, you are invited to drift softly into their forgotten world, not in the voice of judgment, but as if in a bedtime story, slow and gentle, where curiosity is soothed by calmness, where the truths are allowed to emerge one by one, wrapping you like mist as you lie down, perhaps in your own bed, perhaps listening while rain patters faintly against the glass or a cool night hums outside your window, and you begin to imagine yourself sinking into the 1800s, walking softly through the streets of London with a lantern in hand, stepping carefully into a history that was called shameful, but which reveals more about survival, hypocrisy, and human longing than the grand speeches of Parliament or the sermons of bishops. Before we step deeper, take a breath, let your shoulders relax, let your eyelids feel heavy, for this is not a tale to jolt you awake, one to carry you gently across the threshold of sleep, a history that soothes while it unsettles, and as we continue together, remember to subscribe to this channel so these calm journeys return to you each night, and tell me, where are you listening from, and at what hour of your night or day? Because even though you lie in your time in your room, you are part of this unfolding now, a witness across centuries. So close your eyes if you wish and follow me into London, 1850, where the smell of coal and horse manure hangs in the air, where hansom cabs rattle by, where the River Thames glistens dark under the moon, and where, as midnight approaches, women lean in the shadows of Haymarket, Covent Garden, and Whitechapel, adjusting their shawls, painting their cheeks with what little rouge they could afford, each one preparing to trade companionship for coin. Not as a scandal in their own eyes, but as survival itself. Many of these women were invisible daughters of the working poor, pushed from laundries or factories by meager wages that could never pay rent. Some were widows whose husbands had been lost to war, drink, or disease. Others were children abandoned. At 12 or 13, swallowed by a city that demanded labor but offered almost none to those without name or protection, and they found themselves called fallen. Yet the fall was not from some pedestal of purity, but from the fragile ledge of society's neglect. And while sermons thundered against them, men in respectable top hats slipped coins into their hands beneath the cover of darkness, a paradox that defined the entire Victorian age, where virtue was worn like a mask but desire was never absent. The city's newspapers called prostitution the great social evil, and reformers debated laws to contain it. Yet no law could erase the hunger of children or the cold of a winter without shelter. And so the women stood, night after night, as carriages paused, as boots splashed through puddles, as whispers passed through alleyways, where brothels were hidden behind plain wooden doors, their windows shuttered against the watchful eyes of moralists. Imagine stepping closer to such a place, your ears catching the laughter of drunken clerks, the sighs of soldiers on leave, the quiet bargaining between woman and man, words carried softly on the wind like threads of another world that coexisted with the one paraded in daylight, and within this world were rules of its own, a strange economy where beauty could be bartered, where disease lurked as much as affection, where moments of tenderness flickered even among transactions. For not every encounter was brutal. Sometimes there were stories shared, sometimes a tear, sometimes even a trace of comfort in the coldness of life. But those small mercies never made it into official accounts, because history preferred to speak of sin and contagion rather than of resilience and humanity. Yet here, tonight, as you drift deeper, you can listen for the quiet details, like the way women powdered their hair with flour to appear older or richer than they were, or how some carried small bottles of gin to blur the night, or how others tucked keepsakes of children into their bodices, reminders of why they endured the shame cast upon them. Reminders that survival was not selfishness but sacrifice. And if you pause long enough, you will sense how the cobblestones held these secrets. Like a diary written in footsteps, page after page erased each morning by rain, only to be written again by nightfall. And as your breath slows, as the story folds itself around you, remember this: the great contradiction of Victorian England was not that prostitution existed, but that it thrived in the very heart of a society. That pretended purity was its greatest virtue, and the deeper we look, the clearer we see how desire, power, poverty, and hypocrisy intertwined under the same lamps that still burn in London today. So let yourself drift further now, into the rookeries where whole families shared one damp room with prostitutes, into the police courts where women were dragged for soliciting while their customers walked free, into the medical clinics where they were examined like specimens for venereal disease, treated less as humans than as problems, and yet they endured, laughing sometimes, crying often, and always continuing because the night demanded it. And so, as this first part closes, keep your mind curious and soft, for in the next part we will step deeper into the alleys of Whitechapel, where not only the commerce of flesh, but the beginnings of infamous legends would emerge, and the story will grow darker, stranger, and yet still told to you gently, like a candle flickering in the dark, inviting you to follow its light further. The fog deepens now as we move from the wider boulevards into the cramped arteries of Whitechapel, where the very air seems to carry the weight of desperation. And though you may picture the grand streets of London with their shop fronts glittering under gas lamps, here the light is weaker, fading against soot-stained walls and the endless hunger of the poor. And among them, prostitutes were not rare figures but daily presences, woven into the fabric of survival so tightly that to remove them would have been to tear the fabric itself. For here in the East End, where immigrants, dock workers, and beggars crowded into decaying tenements, prostitution was less a scandal than a grim necessity. And yet the rest of society pointed to Whitechapel with a mixture of fear and fascination, as if the very existence of such a district could both condemn and excite at the same time. Picture yourself walking here after midnight, boots splashing through puddles that smell faintly of sewage, your coat pulled tight against the cold, and at every corner a woman calls softly, her voice carrying both invitation and exhaustion. "Looking for company tonight, sir?" Words spoken in countless variations across the decades, but always weighted with the same unspoken truth, that behind the offer lay rent unpaid, mouths unfed, and futures uncertain. And while men bargain for pleasure, women bargain for survival, each transaction another coin that might stave off eviction or hunger for one more night. And within these dark streets, the hypocrisy of Victorian morality grew louder. For though newspapers warned readers of the depravity and danger of such neighborhoods, gentlemen still came, cloaked in anonymity, seeking what they condemned in daylight. And thus the women of Whitechapel were simultaneously despised and desired, criminalized and yet essential, invisible in history yet essential to the rhythms of the city's nights. Some women worked independently, haunting taverns and gin palaces where men gathered, while others were trapped in the houses of madams, where their earnings were stripped from them and the chains of debt bound them as tightly as any physical restraint. And in both cases, choice was rarely as free as later moralists like to imagine. For the choices were between hunger and humiliation, between the workhouse and the alley, between silence and survival. And what a strange economy it was, that an empire priding itself on progress and global might depended, in its shadows, on women left with nothing but their own bodies to trade. Yet even in this darkness, there were odd details that surprise us still, like the practice of women powdering their faces with chalk dust to appear more ghostly under dim gaslight, or how some pinned bright feathers to their shawls so that potential clients could identify them in fog-thick streets, or the curious slang of the trade, where a prostitute might call herself a dollymop, or nymph of the pavement, phrases at once playful and tragic, tokens of identity in a world that denied them names. And then there were the fears that haunted these nights, for syphilis and gonorrhea spread quickly in a time before modern medicine. And though government officials sought to regulate prostitution through the Contagious Diseases Acts, the laws only punished women, forcing them to undergo invasive medical examinations while leaving their male clients untouched. A cruel reminder that Victorian society blamed women for the very sins it consumed in secret. And as you drift deeper into this story, let your imagination linger on the image of a woman walking home at dawn after a night's work. Her shawl pulled tight, her eyes heavy with sleeplessness, yet her heart stubbornly beating with the hope that tomorrow she might find a way out, a way back to respectability, a way toward a life no longer lived in shadows, though such ways were rare. Some women tried to reinvent themselves by marrying clients. Some managed to save enough to open taverns or lodging houses, and a few found shelter in charitable institutions run by reformers, though these too often required renouncing their past entirely, as if survival itself had been a crime that needed repentance. And in these contradictions, we see the essence of the Victorian double life, where society loudly declared virtue, yet secretly depended on vice, where sermons and scandals walk hand in hand. And as you breathe slowly, hearing these truths unfold like pages turning in a forgotten book, notice how the streets of Whitechapel are not silent, but alive with layers of sound, the crack of a whip as a cab drives past, the laughter of drunkards stumbling out of a gin shop, the soft, tired voices of women calling from corners, and beneath it all, a hum of human need that history could not erase. The women here were not just figures in police reports. They were mothers, daughters, and sisters, some singing lullabies to infants in shared tenements, some sending coins back to families in rural villages, some dreaming of escape even as their nights chained them to the alleys, and their endurance is perhaps the strangest detail of all, for they were not symbols of moral collapse, but of survival against collapse, of resilience in the face of a society that abandoned them. Yet Whitechapel's nights would also become infamous in another way, for it was in these same streets that, decades later, whispers would rise of a figure who preyed upon the very women already condemned by society. And though that story belongs to another chapter, its shadow lingers here, a reminder that those who were most vulnerable bore not only the weight of survival, but the danger of being hunted by those who saw them as less than human. But for now, let the image rest gently in your mind, the fog curling like a blanket around dim lamps, the slow rhythm of footsteps on stone, the fragile voices offering company to strangers, and the enduring contradiction of a world that tried to bury these stories but could never erase them entirely, for they remain etched in the silence between the lines of history books, waiting for nights like this, when someone pauses long enough to listen. And as your eyelids grow heavier, let curiosity pull you softly onward, for in the next part, we will slip not only deeper into the underbelly of London, but also into the strange rituals, the hidden codes, and the unspoken agreements that govern this shadow economy, details that will surprise you, unsettle you, and yet still be told as gently as a candle flickering beside your bed. Guiding you forward into the quiet dark dot, step with me further now, beyond the surface of London streets and into the private rhythms of a world that many knew but few admitted. For prostitution in Victorian England was not a random scattering of women across alleys, but a shadow society with its own codes, customs, and unspoken rules, an intricate web of ritual born from necessity, secrecy, and survival. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the patterns, the way a glance could signal more than a sentence, the way a certain corner or doorway marked invisible boundaries of territory, the way slang became armor against judgment, transforming shame into language and language into identity. Imagine a woman leaning at a familiar spot near Drury Lane, nodding to others who recognized her, a silent agreement of shared space. And beneath her shawl, she carries tokens of her trade. A small vial of cheap perfume, a handkerchief embroidered in garish colors, a feather pinned to her bonnet, each item a sign, both to potential clients and to fellow workers, of who she was, what she offered, and where she belonged. For in a city that denied them official recognition, prostitutes created their own systems of recognition. And within this hidden economy, there were divisions that mirrored class itself, with streetwalkers at the bottom, women who stood in alleys and waited for passers-by exposed to police harassment, weather, and violence. While higher up were the women in brothels, sometimes called houses of ill repute or disorderly houses, where madams imposed rules, exacted fees, and ensured a degree of protection, though always at the cost of independence. And higher still were the courtesans, glamorous figures who entertained wealthy men in private lodgings, appearing at opera houses or mass balls, cultivating reputations that allowed them to slip, for a time, into the fringes of respectability. And what a strange paradox it was that in the same city, within a few streets of each other, one prostitute might sell herself for pennies in a dank alley, while another dined on oysters and champagne with a nobleman, both condemned by society, yet living lives worlds apart. And still beneath them ran a common thread, the knowledge that their bodies were their only currency, and that currency could vanish with age, illness, or disgrace. Picture for a moment the rituals of a brothel night lamps lit behind shuttered curtains, rooms furnished with cheap beds and faded drapes, a madam keeping careful watch from her chair, tallying accounts while laughter and sighs drifted through thin walls, and women sitting together between clients, sharing cigarettes, gossip, or scraps of food, joking to keep despair at bay, telling each other of strange encounters or of small dreams they clung to, like one day saving enough for a shop, or one day marrying a man who would not leave them behind, though most knew those hopes were fragile as the glass tumblers they raised in quick toast before returning to work. And there were darker rituals too, for disease haunted these spaces, and the women knew well the signs, the sores that would not heal, the fevers that consumed, the stigma that followed, and yet they had no choice but to continue swallowing. Gin to dull pain, painting cheeks with rouge to mask exhaustion, whispering prayers into the night that the next man would not bring violence, that the next dawn would still come. Still, within this bleakness, there were curiosities that softened the telling, like the odd slang that flourished, with clients called punters or mashers, police known as blue bottles, and prostitutes referring to each other with nicknames that turned hardship into a kind of camaraderie, or the way some women carved messages into tavern tables, coded initials that marked where they had once stood, leaving tiny legacies in wood grain, unnoticed by history, but enduring in spirit. And though reformers tried to intervene with charitable Magdalene homes meant to rescue and rehabilitate, these too often felt like prisons, stripping women of agency under the guise of salvation, demanding repentance without offering real alternatives. So many returned to the streets, choosing the harsh freedom of their trade over the suffocating control of moral institutions. And as you lie here, listening, perhaps letting your body sink deeper into stillness, imagine how these women found small comforts despite the weight they carried, singing quietly to each other in candlelit rooms, pooling coins to buy a shared meal, laughing over the absurdities of men who whispered secrets in bed as if confiding to a lover rather than a stranger, and sometimes even forming bonds that resembled family. For in a city that rejected them, they created their own fragile networks of loyalty and care. Yet the city's gaze was never kind, and newspapers filled with sensational tales of fallen women rarely listened to their voices, painting them instead as symbols of decay, while ignoring the simple reality that most were driven here by poverty, by loss, by hunger, by a society that gave them no place else to stand. And so the rituals continued, night after night, until they became almost invisible, absorbed into the heartbeat of London itself, as if the city could not function without its shadow trade, as if the gaslight itself demanded such stories to justify its glow. And we, listening now, can almost hear the echo of those nights, the soft tread of boots on damp stones, the muted laughter drifting through the fog, the whispers of women negotiating survival one breath at a time. And though this may sound heavy, let the tone remain gentle, for the weight of history can be carried lightly when told in whispers, And as your breathing steadies, feel the calm of this truth that even in the darkest corners of Victorian London, there was resilience, humanity, and a strange kind of ritual that made life possible, even when dignity was denied. And so, as this part closes, let your curiosity drift forward. For in the next part, we will step into the curious relationship between prostitution and the law, exploring how courts, police, and parliament handled this so-called social evil, and how those in power found ways to both condemn and profit from it. A contradiction as fascinating as it is haunting, one that will carry you deeper into sleep as we continue this story together. If you follow the thread of this story into the chambers of law and authority, you will see how the Victorian world, so eager to appear upright and virtuous, wrapped prostitution not only in secrecy but also in legislation, creating a strange theater where women were simultaneously invisible as citizens and yet hyper-visible as subjects of control. For when the problem could no longer be ignored, Parliament and police devised ways to contain it, not by addressing poverty or inequality, but by focusing almost entirely on the women themselves, as though they alone carried the weight of society's moral corruption. And in this hypocrisy lies one of the most revealing truths of the age. Imagine stepping into a police court in the 1860s. The wooden benches crowded with officers in dark blue uniforms, magistrates perched above with powdered wigs and stern expressions. And at the center, a trembling woman arrested for soliciting in the streets. Her offense nothing more than standing under a lamp and speaking to a stranger. Yet the law had little patience for subtlety, and the sentences were swift fines that drained what little she had earned, or short imprisonments that only deepened her misery. And while men who paid for her services slipped quietly away, she bore the public shame alone. To understand how deeply this bias ran, one must look at the Contagious Diseases Acts, introduced in the 1860s, which granted police in certain garrison towns and naval ports the power to arrest women suspected of being prostitutes and force, then to undergo invasive medical examinations for venereal disease, a process so humiliating that it became known among women as instrumental rape, for the law presumed guilt without trial, and the bodies of women were treated as public property in the name of protecting soldiers' health. Yet the men who spread disease faced no such scrutiny, no such loss of dignity, revealing with painful clarity how Victorian law saw women not as people with rights, but as vessels of contamination to be regulated for the good of men. And though the acts applied officially only to certain towns, the spirit of them bled across the nation, emboldening police to harass, intimidate, and control women on suspicion alone, while reformers and medical authorities debated whether to extend such regulation further, their discussions full of statistics and theories, but empty of compassion for the human beings involved, as if these women were laboratory subjects rather than individuals with names, memories, and lives. Yet within this oppression, resistance began to stir, for women themselves, led by figures like Josephine Butler, rose in protest against the acts, speaking in public halls, publishing pamphlets, and daring to confront the hypocrisy of a society that punished women for what it excused in men. And this activism marked one of the earliest moments when women's voices, long silenced, began to echo in political life, challenging not only the laws of prostitution, but the broader inequalities that confined them. And though the struggle was long and often dismissed, it planted seeds that would grow into later movements for suffrage and equality. But while this broader fight unfolded, the daily reality in the streets remained unchanged, for police patrols continued arresting women for loitering, sending them to jails where disease, despair, and overcrowding stripped them further of dignity. And newspapers eagerly reported these cases with a moralizing tone, transforming individual suffering into fodder for public consumption, as if each trial was a small sermon on the wages of sin. Yet, in the background, the government itself profited indirectly, for the existence of prostitution fueled entire networks of lodging houses, taverns, and even landlords who turned blind eyes for rent, ensuring that the trade, though condemned, remained quietly tolerated, for it fed the very economy the authorities claimed to defend. And here, In this contradiction lies the heart of Victorian governance condemned publicly. Control legally, profit privately, and always leave the burden on the women who had the least power to resist. Picture again a courtroom where a woman stands accused, her shawl threadbare, her voice trembling as she pleads, the magistrate unmoved as he orders her to prison for a week, while the men in the gallery shake their heads in moral disapproval, yet step into the same streets at night to seek the very women they judged, and the cycle continued endless, fueled by hypocrisy as much as by hunger. But let us soften the telling again, for while these laws were harsh, within the cracks of the system women found ways to endure, to manipulate the law when they could, to vanish into the crowd when police approached, to create false names and identities that protected them from records, leaving behind a strange kind of ghostly presence in the archives list of aliases, fragments of lives half hidden, as if the women themselves conspired with history to remain ungraspable, unclaimed, by the systems that sought to define them. And if you listen carefully, you may almost hear the quiet defiance in their choices, the way survival itself became resistance, the way each step into another night of work was both an act of necessity and an act of refusal to surrender entirely. For though the law could punish, it could never erase the will to live, and that will echoes even now in the silence between the gas lamps of memory. So as your breath grows steady and your eyelids grow heavy, let your imagination linger here in the courtrooms, the cells, the laws written in ink that bled into women's lives, and yet could never fully define them, and follow the candlelight of curiosity into the next chapter. For in part 5, we will step deeper into the human stories themselves, into the personal voices left behind in diaries, letters, and whispered testimonies. Fragments that remind us that beyond the language of crime and contagion, there were lives lived, loves lost, and truths that refuse to vanish even in the deepest sleep of history. If the courts, the police records, and the medical files show us one cold face of Victorian prostitution, the more haunting truths emerge in the quieter remnants, the diaries scribbled in shaky hands, the letters smudged with ink or tears, the fragments of testimony that slipped through official silence and revealed not statistics but souls. For behind every woman labeled as fallen was a voice that still longed to be heard. And though history muffled most of them, a few echoes survive, and they allow us to lean closer, to listen with compassion, and to realize that the story of prostitution in this era is not merely about law or morality, but about the endless negotiations of love, loss, hope, and despair. Imagine, for instance, a young woman writing by candlelight in a small lodging house, her words addressed to no one in particular, confessing that she had not chosen this path, but been pushed to it, abandoned by a husband who drank away their wages and left her with 2 children to feed. Her pen scratching slowly as she admits that each night she leaves them asleep in the care of another woman, stepping into the darkness to earn the coins that will keep bread on the table, torn between shame and necessity, her words quivering with guilt, yet steady with determination. And though the paper has yellowed with age, her voice is alive still, fragile and human. Or consider another fragment, recorded in a reformer's notebook, where a woman confided that she once loved a soldier, followed him to London, only to be discarded when he was sent abroad, left with nothing but memories and the cruel label of ruin, and with no family willing to receive her back. She drifted inevitably into the streets, where each client's face blurred into another, but she remembered still the first man she loved, the only one she had chosen freely, her. Life divided forever between the before and the after. And then there were the letters never sent, written to parents who would never forgive, to children who might one day read them, to lovers who had long vanished, words that reveal not only the pain of survival, but the stubborn desire to be remembered. As more than a shadow, more than a statistic, more than a body bought and discarded. And within these personal voices lies a tenderness absent from official records, a reminder that prostitution was not a monolith, but a tapestry of individual lives, each one unique, each one carrying its own weight of choices and chances. And when you listen to them closely, you realize that they are not voices of corruption, but voices of endurance, Voices that speak not of moral failure, but of a society that failed them. Picture now the quiet moments between encounters, when women rested on narrow beds in brothel rooms, perhaps humming old songs from childhood, perhaps laughing with one another to stave off despair, perhaps remembering in silence the warmth of a life once lived in innocence. And though reformers painted them as degraded, their humanity never left them, for even in the darkest corners, women found ways to express joy, to create bonds, to hold on to fragments of dignity. Some exchanged trinkets with each other, cheap rings, scraps of ribbon, pressed flowers as tokens of friendship in a world that denied them family. Others wrote poems on scraps of paper, verses about longing, about the Thames, about stars. Glimpsed between rooftops, words that softened nights otherwise hard with labor. And though most of these scraps were lost, the few that remain tell us of resilience, creativity, and the unyielding need to turn pain into meaning. There were also testimonies recorded by social investigators who, though often condescending, sometimes captured flashes of truth, like the woman who said, "I am not wicked, only poor," a statement that sums up the entire contradiction of Victorian society, for sin was not her crime, but poverty was her sentence. And in her simple words lies a truth more powerful than any parliamentary report. And so, as you lie back now, letting your eyes grow heavier, imagine sitting in a dim lodging house beside one of these women, hearing her whisper her story into the night, not as confession but as testimony, not as corruption but as survival. And feel the weight of her humanity pressing gently into the silence. For these voices remind us that history is never only about systems, but always about individuals, each one with a face, a name, a memory. And though most names have been lost, their presence lingers in the very language of the city, in the streets they walked, in the stones worn smooth by their footsteps, in the echoes of laughter and sorrow that refuse to be erased. And perhaps, in listening now, you participate in a quiet justice, giving space to lives that were denied dignity in their own time, remembering them not as shadows, but as people who loved, who hoped, who dreamed, even when the world insisted they were nothing more than sin. So as your breath slows and you drift further, let your curiosity carry you forward. For in the next part, we will step into the strange interplay of prostitution and medicine, exploring how Victorian doctors and reformers turned women into subjects of study, how science was used to stigmatize even as it claimed to heal, and how the very language of disease became another chain upon those who already bore too many, a chapter both chilling and illuminating, to be told softly in the flickering calm of night dot as the story moves forward. We cannot avoid the shadow of medicine, for in Victorian England prostitution was not only a moral question and a legal puzzle, but also a subject of intense medical scrutiny, a stage upon which doctors, reformers, and scientists projected their fears and their authority, turning women's bodies into battlegrounds of disease and morality. And though they spoke in the language of science, their practices often revealed as much prejudice as progress, for the so-called medical gaze treated prostitutes less as patients than as specimens to be examined, recorded, and controlled. Imagine the cramped consulting room of a Victorian physician, dimly lit, smelling faintly of carbolic and tobacco, with shelves of thick books and jars of preserved organs, and there a woman sits, weary and ashamed, compelled by police order, under the Contagious Diseases Acts, to undergo an invasive inspection, the doctor coolly noting her condition as if she were an object of study, not a human being, and in his notebooks her name becomes a statistic, her suffering reduced to a line of ink in a ledger of vice and contagion. Venereal disease, particularly syphilis and gonorrhea, loomed large over this discourse, and while reformers spoke of saving society from infection, the actual burden of shame and suffering fell almost entirely upon the women, for soldiers and sailors were rarely blamed, their illness explained away as unfortunate consequence, while the women who contracted or spread it were branded as corrupt, impure, dangerous, their very existence equated with disease. Medical texts of the period describe prostitutes as vectors, as reservoirs of contagion, words that stripped away identity and transformed poverty into pathology. And so the women became trapped not only in the economic chains of survival, but also in the stigmas of science, locked into roles they could never escape. For even those who tried to lead the trade carried with them the labels of contamination, unable to shed the marks placed upon them by doctors who claimed objectivity but acted from judgment. And yet, within this grimness, there are curious details that remind us of the contradictions of the time, like the fact that many prostitutes themselves became surprisingly knowledgeable about disease, recognizing the early signs, sharing advice with one another about symptoms, and even adopting crude preventive methods, such as using vinegar or alum as washes, carrying sponges, or insisting on certain practices with clients. Measures born not of science, but of necessity, small acts of self-preservation in a world that denied them real medical care. Some brothels even kept their own house doctors, who, for a fee, would examine women and declare them fit for work, though these examinations were often cursory, more about protecting profits than protecting health. And in this strange intersection of commerce and medicine, we see how Victorian society commodified not only women's bodies, but also their illnesses, turning both into transactions. Meanwhile, in universities and hospitals, young medical students dissected cadavers of women labeled as prostitutes, their bodies donated or claimed without consent, reinforcing again the cruel irony that women denied dignity in life were denied. It also in death, serving as teaching material for generations of doctors who spoke of them clinically, never personally. And as you let this image settle softly in your mind, you might feel the weight of the silence they endured. For while men's diseases were discussed in journals and debated in Parliament, women's voices rarely entered the record. Their experience of pain, of fear, of humiliation dismissed as irrelevant. And yet in the small fragments that remain, an investigator noting a woman's plea, a reformer recording her protest, we glimpse the truth. That medicine, while claiming to heal, often deepened the wounds of stigma. But even here, in this harshness, women resisted in quiet ways, refusing examinations when they could, fleeing towns where laws were enforced, disguising themselves to avoid police. And in these acts, we see again that resilience is never entirely extinguished, that even under the gaze of authority, there flickers the ember of defiance. And if we look closer, we find further curiosities, such as the moral panic around hereditary syphilis, where doctors warn that children will be born diseased if prostitutes bore them, fueling further fear and justification for control. And yet many such warnings were exaggerated, based less on observation than on prejudice, showing again how science was bent to fit morality, how the appearance of objectivity masked deeper judgments. And still, despite the fear, prostitutes bore children, raised them in tenements, sent them to ragged schools, weaving love into their harsh realities, proving again that life pushed on in spite of stigma, that tenderness found space even in condemned corners. Picture now a lodging house where a woman returns after such an examination, shoulders heavy, eyes downcast, sitting with her companions as they pour her a glass of gin and offer quiet words. Small gestures of comfort that restore humanity against the dehumanizing gaze of science. And it is in these gestures that we find the true medicine of survival, not in the instruments of doctors, but in the solidarity of women who held each other through nights of fear. So as your breath steadies and your mind drifts deeper into this history, remember that the medical chapters of Victorian prostitution are not only stories of disease, but stories of how power used disease as a tool of control, and how women, despite everything, carved out spaces of care, resilience, and even laughter in the face of stigma. And so, as this part draws to a close, let your curiosity remain awake enough to follow us further. For in the next chapter, we will step into the paradox of how prostitution, condemned by society, seeped into its culture nonetheless in literature, in theater, in whispers of art and scandal, showing us that even what society tried hardest to silence found its way into the heart of Victorian imagination. A story as strange as it is revealing, waiting for you in the calm dark of the next part. Though polite society worked tirelessly to conceal prostitution from view, to pretend it was an external stain that could be scoured away with sermons and legislation, the truth is that it seeped deeply into the very culture of Victorian England, leaving fingerprints across literature, theater, journalism, and art. Sometimes as shadow, sometimes as scandal, sometimes disguised under euphemism, but always there, haunting the imagination of an age that prided itself on restraint, yet could not stop circling around the subject it condemned. If you walk with me into the pages of Victorian novels, you will notice how certain characters appear again and again fallen women, tragic maidens, mysterious mistresses figures who carried within them the coded presence of prostitution without ever being named outright, for authors who wish to sell books to respectable households could rarely speak plainly. And so they cloaked their commentary in allegory and moral lessons, presenting women who strayed as victims to be pitied or as warnings to be avoided, yet in both cases ensuring that their image remained vivid in the minds of readers. Consider Dickens, whose novels often brushed against the subject, with characters like Nancy and Oliver Twist, a woman who lives by the margins, whose fate is sealed by the violence of the underworld. And though Dickens never names her profession, readers understood, and her death was staged as both tragedy and moral lesson, a reflection of how the era sought to humanize and demonize in the same breath. Or Thomas Hardy, whose Tess of the D'Urbervilles would later echo similar themes of sexual exploitation, presenting a young woman judged harshly by society for what was done to her rather than what she chose, echoing the fate of countless real women whose names never reached the page. And beyond literature, the theater too could not resist these stories, for while respectable plays avoided explicit reference, the music halls and penny theaters of London made sly nods, weaving jokes about nymphs of the pavement into comic routines, while melodramas staged the ruin of innocent girls lured into the city, their fate serving as both entertainment and moral fable, audiences gasping, laughing, or weeping, all the while consuming the very stories they claimed to reject. Newspapers, too, played their part, filling columns with lurid reports of fallen women, describing raids on brothels with sensational detail, their language at once moralizing and titillating, ensuring that readers were both warned and entertained, their curiosity fed under the pretense of outrage. And in this cycle of scandal journalism, we see clearly how Victorian culture could not look away from what it condemned. Even in art, the subject lingered in curious ways, paintings of women in shadowed interiors, faces turned away, suggestive. Titles like Awakening Conscience or The Outcast, works that carried moral overtones but also invited the viewer to gaze at the forbiddance, to indulge in the very fascination they pretended to resist. And here again the contradiction of the age appears, a culture obsessed with respectability, yet drawn irresistibly to the spectacle of its own hypocrisy. But within this cultural fascination, there were also small acts of empathy, moments when writers or artists sought not only to condemn but to reveal, to show the pain, the humanity, the endurance of women whose voices were otherwise erased. And though these moments were often cloaked in moralism, they planted seeds of awareness in readers who might otherwise never have thought about the lives of prostitutes beyond caricature. Imagine sitting in a Victorian parlor, gaslight flickering as a serialized novel is read aloud by a family gathered around the fire. And though the father shakes his head gravely at the fate of a fallen woman character, and the mother murmurs that it is a sad warning, the children listening are struck by the tragedy, by the unfairness, by the humanity that slips through the moral lesson. And in their hearts a small question is planted: why should society punish so harshly those who had so little choice? And thus, through fiction, the silenced voices found a backdoor into the public imagination. In this way, prostitution, though banished from polite conversation, shaped the very stories Victorians told themselves about sin, virtue, poverty, and redemption, becoming a silent character in the drama of an entire age. Yet the fascination was not harmless, for the same cultural obsession reinforced the stigma, ensuring that women could be portrayed as symbols but never as individuals. as metaphors, but never as mothers or daughters with names, desires, and memories. And in this paradox lies the deeper truth, that prostitution lived in Victorian culture not as a reality to be understood, but as a canvas onto which anxieties, fears, and fantasies were projected. Still, if we read carefully today, we can see between the lines, hearing the whispers of the real women whose lives inspired these portrayals, their resilience shining faintly through the moral varnish, their laughter and tears echoing faintly. In novels, plays, and paintings that pretended to teach morality but could not help betraying fascination. And so, as your eyes grow heavier, drifting with the rhythm of this story, imagine Victorian England not only as a city of fog and gaslight, but as a stage where every sermon, every article, every novel, every painting carried in its shadows the ghost of prostitution, a presence unacknowledged yet inescapable, shaping the imagination of a society that lived in contradiction. And let that thought carry you softly onward. For in the next part, we will step beyond the culture of fascination into the very economics of this hidden trade, exploring how money moved through the shadow markets of London, how brothels and landlords, taverns and pawnbrokers profited, and how an entire underground economy thrived on what society pretended to despise. A world of coins and debts and strange transactions that reveal as much about Victorian life as the grand palaces and banks of daylight. If culture kept prostitution alive as a shadowy fascination, it was the flow of money that kept it alive in practice. For prostitution in Victorian England was not only a social or moral phenomenon, but also an economy, a hidden marketplace woven through the city's veins, supporting taverns, brothels, landlords, pawnbrokers, and even police officers who looked the other way for a fee. And once you begin to see its financial structures, you understand how deeply it was embedded into London's life, as ordinary and systemic as coal or bread, though spoken of only in whispers. Imagine following a single coin as it changes hands. A gentleman pays a woman for her company. She in turn pays her lodging keeper for a bed. The lodging keeper pays the landlord for rent, and the landlord tips the constable to avoid raids. The coin moving seamlessly from shadow to respectability, from vice to virtue, revealing that the trade condemned from pulpits was silently fueling the very structures of society. In the alleys of Whitechapel and the markets of Covent Garden, money moved quickly and in small sums, women earning just enough for food and shelter, often pawning items the next morning to pay for gin or bread. Their financial lives a constant, juggling act of debt and survival, while in the brothels of the West End the sums were larger, with wealthy clients paying for opulent surroundings, for champagne, for velvet curtains, and mirrored walls, the profits flowing upward into the pockets of madams and landlords who operate with quiet impunity. And here lies one of the cruelest truths, that while prostitutes themselves often remain poor, those who managed or exploited them profited handsomely, building comfortable lives out of the labor of women whose own earnings slipped away almost as soon as they were made. Brothel madams, often former prostitutes themselves, stood as both protectors and exploiters, taking a share of every transaction, setting rules, enforcing debts, while presenting themselves as businesswomen within a world that refused to call it business. And many such houses operated openly, their location known, their doors marked discreetly by a curtain or a lamp, tolerated so long as they did not draw scandal. For landlords received regular rent and police received their share of silence. Even taverns and gin shops benefited, for prostitutes often brought clients there, and the sale of alcohol thrived on the pairing of drink and desire, while pawnbrokers flourished by exchanging cash for trinkets, rings, or clothing items passed from desperate hands into shops where they would be sold again and again, each object a silent witness to nights unspoken. And the women themselves, trapped in this cycle, found it nearly impossible to rise, for the cost of survival devoured their income. Lodging, food, alcohol, clothing, bribes, debts owed to madams or landlords, all leaving them with little to save, little to transform their lives. And in this way, the economy ensured their entrapment. their labor sustaining others while they themselves lived on the edge of destitution. Yet within this grim economy, there were strange quirks, small curiosities that revealed a texture of life, such as the existence of dress lenders, women who rented out finer gowns to prostitutes for a fee, allowing them to appear wealthier. To clients, though the cost often outweighed the profit, or the way some prostitutes invested in bright ribbons, feathers, or jewelry, not as luxuries, but as tools of trade, advertising themselves in crowded streets where visibility meant survival. And there were darker curiosities too, like the practice of pimps or bullies, who coerced women into debt and controlled their earnings, or the landlords who charged higher rents for rooms used for prostitution, profiting from the very trade they condemned in public. Step back from this, and you see the larger picture. Prostitution was not an isolated vice, but an economy threaded into the fabric of the city, touching landlords, merchants, police, and even the state, which collected taxes indirectly through rents and fees, making the moral outrage of society ring hollow when compared to the financial dependence it quietly held on the very practice it denounced. And so the hypocrisy deepens. For the sermons that thundered about purity were paid for with tithes from congregants whose wealth was often linked, in some small way, to the hidden economy of sex, and the politicians who decried vice often knew that their districts ran on the quiet profits of the shadow trade. Picture again the streets at night, coins changing hands with a metallic clink, slipping from palm to palm, while above, in fine houses, gaslight glows on walls built with rents collected from those very exchanges. A city at once divided and united by money, its purity a fiction, its economy deeply entangled with what it claimed to despise. And if you allow your imagination to linger here, you will see how the real scandal was not the existence of prostitution, but the way society profited from it while pretending otherwise. A silence built not only on shame but on convenience, and perhaps you will sense the quiet anger that must have burned in some women as they realized that everyone gained from their labor except themselves. Yet still they carried on, resilient, inventive, finding ways to stretch coins into meals, forming networks to share debts, pooling earnings when one of them was sick, building fragile economies of care beneath the ruthless economies of exploitation. And as your eyelids grow heavier and your breath slows, let this image remain with you, the strange, relentless movement of money through Victorian London, clinking softly in the shadows, connecting rich and poor, respectable and condemned. A hidden lifeblood that revealed the city's true contradictions. And let your curiosity guide you into the next part, for we will turn now toward the everyday rituals and survival strategies of the women themselves, the small habits, the routines, the hidden strengths that allowed them to endure night after night, weaving lives of quiet resilience amid the fog of judgment and the silence of history. A chapter both intimate and revealing, waiting gently in the darkness of the story ahead. If money kept the hidden market alive, it was the women's daily rituals that kept them alive within it. And though history has painted their lives as nothing but degradation, the truth is more complex, for survival is not only about enduring hunger or danger, but also about carving out moments of control, crafting habits that gave structure to chaos, and weaving small routines that softened the sharp edges of existence. And so when you look closely at the daily lives of Victorian prostitutes, you find not only suffering, but also resourcefulness. Small acts of resilience that remind us that even in the darkest corners of society, human beings reach instinctively for order and meaning. Picture a woman waking late in the morning after a long night on the streets, stirring in a small rented room that she shares with others, the air heavy with stale smoke and the faint odor of gin, pulling a shawl tighter around her shoulders. Before stepping into the narrow alley to fetch water or to wash in a tin basin, the ritual of cleansing, not only about hygiene, but about resetting the self, preparing for another day. Her clothing, often worn thin, must be tended to, and so she might sew a rip, polish a shoe, re-dye a bonnet feather, for appearance mattered, not in the sense of vanity, but in the sense of survival. The brighter and more polished she looked, the better chance of attracting clients in a crowded, competitive market. Food, if it could be afforded, was simple bread tea, sometimes a slice of meat bought cheaply, often shared with others. And this act of sharing itself became part of survival. For the women formed small communities, bonds of solidarity where one might lend coins, another share a crust, another watch over a child, building networks of care in a city that gave them none. And as the day wore on, some women slept through the afternoon, resting for the night ahead, while others walked the streets, visited pawnbrokers, or ran small errands. There lives a constant balancing of debt and need. Their rituals tied not to luxury, but to necessity. Yet, within these necessities were curiosities that reveal something tender, like the way some women kept small pets. A bird in a cage, a cat curled on a bed, companions that provided comfort and warmth, anchors of affection in lives otherwise judged unworthy. Or how some gathered in taverns before nightfall, sharing songs, jokes, and gossip, their laughter a shield against despair, turning their camaraderie into a ritual of strength, as if to remind one another that they were not entirely alone. When night returned, the rituals began again: the choosing of street corners, the pacing under gas lamps, the scanning of faces for potential clients. Each gesture repeated so many times it became second nature, yet each night unpredictable, filled with both danger and opportunity, the women adapting constantly, carrying hidden strategies. A look exchanged with another woman to signal trouble, a quick retreat to a friendly lodging house when police appear, a stash of coins hidden, away from pimps or landlords. Even in encounters with clients, rituals emerged. Some women demanded payment up front to avoid being cheated. Others insisted on certain places or positions, using rules as a thin barrier of control in a world that offered them so little. And, though these gestures may seem small, they represent the human instinct to carve out agency wherever possible. After work, late into the night, some women drank heavily to dull the weight of memory. Others returned quietly to their rooms to sleep. And in those hours between work and dawn, you could find the most intimate rituals of all: writing letters that would never be sent, praying softly despite a life condemned by the church, holding on to keepsakes of children or lost loves, reminding themselves that they were more than the role society imposed. And in this mixture of necessity, habit, and resilience, we glimpse the full complexity of their existence. Lives not defined only by the transactions of the street, but also by the small rhythms that kept them tethered to humanity. Reformers who visited these women often remarked, with surprise, at their tenderness toward one another, at their humor, at their endurance, traits overlooked by a society that painted them only as corrupted. And perhaps here lies the most important lesson: that survival is not only about enduring the external world, but also about maintaining inner worlds of meaning, rituals that turn even poverty into something livable. So, as you rest now and imagine these rhythms, let the picture settle gently: the sewing of a shawl, the feeding of a bird, the laughter shared over cheap gin, the quiet prayers whispered into the darkness, and realize that these small acts of endurance were as much a part of Victorian prostitution as the transactions themselves. Threads of life weaving through the shadows, keeping women alive in body and in spirit. And as your breath slows, let your curiosity remain softly awake. For in the next part, we will move from the quiet resilience of daily rituals into the looming specter of violence, exploring how danger stalked these women on every street, how brutality from clients, pimps, and even police shadowed their nights, and how they found ways, however fragile, to resist or endure, a chapter darker and heavier, yet still told to you gently, like a voice fading into dream, guiding you forward. If the small rituals of daily survival offered women a fragile sense of control, those rituals existed always under the looming shadow of violence. For in Victorian England, a prostitute's night was never free from danger. And every step into the gaslit fog carried with it the possibility of brutality from men, harassment from police, exploitation from pimps, or cruelty from strangers who saw them as less than human. And though history often speaks of this violence only in passing, for the women themselves it was a constant presence. shaping the rhythm of their lives as surely as hunger or poverty. Imagine walking through Whitechapel or Holborn at midnight, the lamplight stretching thin against the fog, a woman adjusting her shawl, keeping her eyes sharp as a group of drunken men pass by, some shouting lewd remarks, some reaching out with rough hands, the line between a paying client and a violent aggressor as thin as a whispered word, and every encounter a gamble, every negotiation a risk. Many women carried scars physical and invisible from nights when men refused to pay, when fists struck, when knives appeared, and though some reported these crimes, police often dismissed them, seeing prostitutes as unworthy of protection. Their suffering treated as the inevitable consequence of their trade, and so women learned to defend themselves in whatever ways they could, some carrying pins or knives hidden in clothing, others relying on allies in the streets, calling out to one another when danger arose, building fragile systems of defense against a world that offered them none. Yet violence did not come only from clients, but also from the very institutions that claimed to uphold order, for constables, empowered by laws against solicitation, harass and extorted women, demanding bribes or favors in exchange for silence, turning law enforcement into another layer of exploitation, while magistrates sentenced women harshly for loitering or drunkenness, ignoring the brutalities they endured nightly. And if the law itself was violent in its indifference, so too were the men who controlled the trade from the shadows pimps, known as bullies, who coerced women with threats, who beat them into submission, who took their earnings, binding them with debts and fear, creating a cycle of domination from which escape was nearly impossible. The brothels, though offering some degree of shelter, were not always free from danger either, for madams ruled strictly, punishing disobedience, expelling women who fell ill or aged, discarding them as though they were broken tools, leaving them vulnerable once more to the streets. And beyond these known dangers was the most chilling threat of all, the predators who stalked the streets with darker intentions, men who sought not only sex but control, domination, or cruelty. And it was from this landscape of violence that later legends of infamous killers would emerge, their crimes shocking the nation. But the truth is that long before such names became headlines, countless acts of brutality had already been committed in silence, unrecorded, unpunished, forgotten, except by the women who bore their weight. Still, despite all this, the women endured. And here lies another paradox of their story, that even in a world steeped in violence, they found ways to resist, to adapt, to survive, and sometimes even to laugh, their resilience shining through. In the darkest nights, some formed alliances, watching over one another at street corners, warning of dangerous men, sharing information about which taverns or alleys were safe and which were not, building fragile networks of safety that were never foolproof, but better than facing the night alone. Others found brief refuge in relationships, sometimes with regular clients who offered protection, sometimes with lovers who, though imperfect, gave them a measure of security in a city where trust was scarce. And in these acts of endurance, you see not only survival, but also humanity refusing to be extinguished, a reminder that violence did not define them entirely, even if it shaped their nights. Yet, as your breath steadies and you drift deeper into this story, it is important to acknowledge how the weight of violence carved itself into their lives. For the bruises and scars were not only on their bodies, but also on their spirits, their sense of worth eroded by a society that treated their pain as invisible. And so their resilience was not merely physical, but deeply emotional. A constant effort to remind themselves that they were still human in a world that insisted they were not. Picture a woman returning to her lodging at dawn, her body aching from assault, yet still she sits beside her companions, sips from a cup of tea, laughs at a shared joke, the laughter trembling but real, a small act of defiance against a world that wanted her broken. And in that moment, she proves that survival is not only endurance, but also the refusal to surrender completely. And so, as this part draws to a close, let your imagination settle on the image of the foggy Victorian street. both alive with danger and echoing with resilience. And allow curiosity to carry you gently into the next part, where we will explore how society at large beyond the courts and police constructed the moral myths around prostitution, how sermons, pamphlets, and social campaigns shaped the narrative of fallen women, and how these myths, repeated endlessly, created cages of stigma that trapped women as surely as any iron bars. A chapter quieter, but no less haunting, told to you softly as you drift further into the night. If violence shaped the hidden nights of prostitutes, it was myth that shaped the daylight story told about them. For Victorian England constructed an elaborate web of moral narratives around what it called the fallen woman, a phrase that carried with it not only judgment, but also the power to imprison a woman's identity for life. And though these myths were draped in the language of morality, they were less about truth and more about control, shaping how society imagined, feared, and condemned women who stepped outside its rigid ideals. Imagine a pulpit on a Sunday morning, the preacher's voice rising against the hum of a packed congregation, his words filled with fire about purity, chastity, and the dangers of temptation, warning young women to guard their virtue as though it were treasure and warning young men to resist the snares of vice. Yet in this moral theater, the prostitute was not seen as a woman with a story, but as a symbol, an embodiment of sin, stripped of individuality and turned into a cautionary tale, a shadow to frighten daughters and to excuse sons. Pamphlets and tracts were printed in the thousands, distributed by reformed societies, filled with lurid descriptions of urban vice, illustrations of women in rags leaning under gas lamps, headlines proclaiming the wages of sin, the great social evil, the ruin of innocence. And though these pamphlets claimed to be educational, they were often sensational, their language feeding the same curiosity they claimed to condemn, ensuring that the image of the prostitute remained vivid in the public imagination. Novels, too, joined in the myth-making, endlessly repeating the archetype of the girl who left the countryside, came to London in search of work, was seduced or betrayed, and soon fell, her life thereafter portrayed as irreversible decline. A morality tale that suggested once a woman slipped, she could never climb back, as though redemption were impossible, as though one misstep ended all. And within this myth of the fallen woman lay a cruel paradox. Society obsessed over her fall, but refused to acknowledge what pushed her: poverty, abandonment, coercion, hunger, preferring instead to paint her downfall as the result of her own weakness or sin, thus allowing society itself to remain blameless. Sermons, newspapers, novels, art all collaborated in sustaining this myth, reinforcing a cage of stigma that trapped women even when they tried to leave the trade. For once labeled fallen, they found doors closed to respectable work, families unwilling to receive them, and communities that whispered behind their backs, ensuring that the myth was not just story but sentence. Reformers who sought to rescue prostitutes often reinforced the myth unintentionally, speaking of them as souls to be saved, as victims in need of redemption, but rarely as equals with voices of their own. And even in their compassion there was condescension, a sense that the fallen woman must be reformed into a model of virtue before she could be accepted, erasing the complexity of her life. Yet, if you look closely, you can see cracks in this myth, for some women resisted the label, mocking it in their own slang, refusing to internalize the condemnation, living as they pleased despite the stigma, while others, through rare memoirs or testimonies, revealed themselves not as passive victims, but as women who had made choices within impossible constraints, choices that deserve understanding rather than judgment. Still, the power of the myth was immense, for it allowed Victorian society to protect its illusions. By imagining prostitutes as corrupted and irredeemable, it could preserve the fantasy of pure wives, innocent daughters, and virtuous homes, even though the same men who filled those homes often visited the women they condemned. And in this hypocrisy lies the real darkness of the story. Picture a girl arriving in London at 15, taking work in a laundry, her wages barely enough to buy bread, then losing her job when she falls ill, wandering the streets hungry, until someone offers her money for what she had once guarded. And from that moment, society declares her fallen, closing every path of respectability, branding her for life. And yet in truth, she was not wicked, not evil, only poor, only cornered, only surviving. But the myth erased that truth, replacing it with a caricature that suited the needs of a culture eager to condemn. And as you let your breath slow and your eyelids grow heavy, imagine how many women carried that myth like a shadow, following them through every step, every glance, every interaction, and realize that the real prison of prostitution was not only hunger, not only violence, but stigma itself, a story told about them that they could never escape. Yet in listening now, gently, softly, with curiosity rather than judgment, you undo a little of that myth. You allow their humanity to breathe again. You hear them not as symbols but as people. And so, as this part closes, let your mind rest with the awareness that behind every myth lies a silenced truth, and allow curiosity to lead you onward. For in the next part, we will explore the rare but remarkable attempts to challenge these mischarities, campaigns, and voices that dared to argue for compassion and change, efforts that flickered like small candles against the vast night of stigma, and which remind us that even in the most judgmental ages, there were those who tried to listen. If myths painted prostitutes as irredeemable, there were always voices, sometimes faint, sometimes fierce, that rose to challenge that story, to insist that women caught in the web of prostitution were not monsters or contagions, but human beings, deserving of compassion. And though these efforts often struggled against the tide of stigma, they flickered like small lamps in the fog of Victorian judgment, offering not absolution but recognition, not always freedom, but at least acknowledgement. At the center of these challenges stood reform movements and charities, many run by religious groups who established rescue homes and Magdalene institutions intended to draw women away from the streets, to house them, clothe them, train them in respectable trades such as sewing, laundry, or domestic service, and to prepare them for re-entry into society. And though some of these institutions provided real shelter and relief, many carried with them the same paternalism that haunted Victorian morality, demanding repentance, enforcing strict discipline, and insisting that women erase every trace of their former lives in order to be accepted, as though survival itself had been a sin. And for many women, this rescue felt more like captivity. Another set of rules, another loss of agency, so that some slipped away, returning to the streets rather than enduring the suffocating control of charity. Yet amid this landscape of conditional compassion, there were reformers who saw more clearly, who refused to accept the hypocrisy of laws and myths. And chief among them was Josephine Butler, a formidable woman whose voice rang loudly across England as she campaigned against the Contagious Diseases Acts, arguing that the laws were not only cruel but unjust, that they treated women as criminals while allowing men to go free, and her campaign, radical, controversial, and often ridiculed nevertheless, grew into a movement, gathering supporters who demanded the repeal of laws that violated women's rights. Imagine Butler standing before a crowded hall, her voice steady, her words defiant, denouncing the double standard of a society that claimed to protect morality while in truth protecting only men's privilege. And in that act, she gave dignity to thousands of silenced women. Her campaign, one of the first to link prostitution to the broader question of women's rights, planting seeds that would grow into later battles for suffrage and equality. Alongside Butler's activism, there were local efforts too. Small charities run by women who opened their homes to prostitutes, not to control but to care, offering food, shelter, and kindness without demanding erasure. And in these quiet acts, we glimpsed the possibility of a different narrative, one that saw women not as fallen but as human, not as sinners but as survivors. Yet reform was always a double-edged sword, for even as some campaigned for compassion, others sought stricter control, proposing harsher punishments, stricter laws, and more invasive medical measures, their arguments framed as protection, but driven by fear, ensuring that the struggle for justice was always contested, always fragile. And still, in this contested landscape, moments of hope shine like the stories of women who, aided by charities or friendships, managed to leave the streets, who found work, who built new lives, who wrote letters of gratitude or defiance, reminding us that escape was possible, though rare, and that even in the darkest systems, there were cracks through which light entered. Picture a small rescue home at the edge of London, a group of women sitting together sewing, their laughter soft, their futures uncertain, but their present moment safe, a fragile sanctuary carved out against the storm, and know that such places, however imperfect, mattered, for they gave women a chance to breathe, to imagine themselves differently, if only for a while. And as you rest here with this part of the story, consider how reform efforts reveal not only compassion, but contradiction. For they show us that even in a society drowning in hypocrisy, there were always those who resisted, who questioned, who demanded better, and it is in their voices that we hear the beginnings of change, the earliest murmurs of a world that might one day recognize women not as symbols but as equals. So as your eyelids grow heavier, let this thought carry you gently forward, that even against vast silence, compassion persisted, and even in the harshest ages, there were those who tried to listen and allow curiosity to draw you into the next part, where we will explore how prostitution intersected not only with morality and law, but with empire itself. For the reach of Victorian Britain extended far beyond London, and with it spread the contradictions, controls, and hypocrisies of prostitution across the colonies, creating a global shadow that reveals how deeply this story is tied to the empire's own heartbeat. If we widen our gaze beyond the foggy streets of London, we begin to see how prostitution was not only a domestic matter of morality and survival, but also a phenomenon entangled with the vast machinery of empire. For Victorian England's dominion stretched across continents, and wherever soldiers and officials went, prostitution followed, shadowing the empire's conquest like an unspoken companion, tolerated in silence, yet policed with the same contradictions we have already seen at home. In India, in Hong Kong, in the Caribbean, in garrison towns and naval ports from Gibraltar to Cape Town, women were recruited, coerced, or forced into service in the troops who were the backbone of imperial control. And just as in London, the burden of morality, disease, and stigma was placed almost entirely upon them, while the men who paid and profited walked away untouched. Imagine a cantonment town in colonial India, rows of barracks under the searing sun, British soldiers restless after drills, and just beyond the fences, a set of huts known openly as lock hospitals or chaklas, places where local women were confined, examined, and made to serve. Their lives reduced to instruments of military convenience, their identities erased beneath the colonial gaze. The Contagious Diseases Acts, first applied in Britain, found even harsher enforcement in the colonies, for officials argued that controlling venereal disease among troops was essential to imperial stability, and so women, often poor, often trafficked, sometimes only girls, were subjected to forced examinations and confinement. Their bodies treated as extensions of military property, their dignity stripped in the name of empire. And here the hypocrisy deepened still further. For while the empire claimed to bring civilization, law, and virtue to the lands it conquered, in practice, it institutionalized the exploitation of women, embedding prostitution into the very structures of colonial life, ensuring that the great social evil was not only Britain's problem, but the empire's export, spread across seas like cargo, unacknowledged yet omnipresent. Back in England, few spoke of this openly, yet the shadow was known, whispered in reports, debated in Parliament when scandals erupted. And reformers like Josephine Butler saw clearly that the oppression of prostitutes at home was mirrored abroad, that the empire's might rested not only on trade and military power, but on the silenced bodies of women treated as expendable. And if you pause to consider this, you realize that prostitution in the Victorian world was not simply a moral failing or an urban scandal, but part of the very foundation of a global system, a hidden scaffolding propping up the empire's facade of order, Picture the global circulation of ships, soldiers, and officials, carrying with them not only goods and guns, but also demands for women's bodies, demands met by systems of coercion, by local intermediaries, by colonial laws that regulate it. Women, while excusing men, reproducing in every port the same double standards we have traced in London's courts. Yet, even in this grimness, voices rose: women in India resisting confinement, missionaries and activists decrying the abuse, reports smuggled back to England describing the conditions of locked hospitals, and campaigns demanding reform, all of which revealed that the struggle against stigma and exploitation was not confined to one city, but stretched across the globe, linking the fate of prostitutes in Whitechapel to those in Calcutta or Hong Kong, their suffering connected by the empire's vast, invisible web. And perhaps the most haunting truth is that many of these women were forgotten twice: once by the empire that used them, and again by the histories that preferred to speak of battles and treaties rather than a hunger, desire, and the human cost of conquest. Yet if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint resonance of their presence, as though the empire's stones themselves hold the memory of voices erased. And so, as you rest in the calm of this story, let your imagination expand outward, seeing London not as an isolated stage, but as part of a global theater where prostitution, law, medicine, and morality played out against the backdrop of empire, shaping lives in every corner of Victorian rule. And as your eyelids grow heavier, let this global vision guide you softly toward the next part, where we will return to the intimate scale once more, exploring how women themselves, despite empire, despite stigma, despite violence, found ways to express resilience through friendship, through humor, through fleeting joys, building fragile yet enduring communities in the very heart of the world that rejected them. A quieter chapter, but one filled with humanity, waiting just beyond the dark veil of history. If empire expanded the shadow of prostitution across continents, it was within the small and hidden corners of daily life that women themselves built their most enduring defenses, not of law or wealth, but of companionship, fragile networks of trust that softened the blows of poverty and violence. And when you look past the statistics and sermons, you find the quiet resilience of friendships, of laughter shared in dimly lit rooms, of women who, though rejected by society, create communities of their own. Imagine a lodging house in the East End, the wooden stairs creaking as women climb up after a night on the streets, their pockets light with coins, their shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Yet in the upstairs room they gather around a tin teapot, sharing bread and tea, trading stories of strange clients or dangerous encounters, their voices rising in laughter that cuts briefly through despair, for humor became a shield, a way of transforming humiliation into survival. And in these moments, they reminded one another that they were not merely objects of use or targets of judgment, but human beings with wit, resilience, and joy. Some friendships lasted only a night, a shared glance under a gas lamp, a warning whispered about a violent man, a loan of a shawl against the cold. Yet even such fleeting acts mattered, forming a thread of solidarity that stretched invisibly through the city's streets. Others endured for years, with women forming bonds that resemble family, caring for one another's children, pooling money for rent, watching over each other when illness came, their loyalty all the more fierce, because it existed in defiance of a society that denied them belonging. Brothels, too, for all their exploitation, often became spaces of community, where women sat together between clients, singing old songs, braiding each other's hair, joking about the absurdities of men, turning the thin walls into a kind of sisterhood, fragile but real. And there were other, smaller rituals of resilience, keeping pets, as some women did, a cat to curl at their feet, a bird to chirp in the morning, tiny companions that offered affection where society withheld it, or writing poems and letters, not always to be sent, but to remind themselves that they still had voices, that their inner worlds could not be silenced. Reformers who entered these spaces often remarked, sometimes with surprise, at the tenderness they witnessed, the way women comforted one another after assaults, the way they shared jokes even in poverty, the way they celebrated small victories, like finding a safe client or paying off a debt. Victory is invisible to the outside world, but luminous within the small communities they created. And it is in these details that we see how resilience is not only endurance against suffering, but the creation of joy in spite of it. The insistence that laughter, kindness, and connection still matter even in the darkest conditions. Picture again the streets at night. Two women standing together under a lamp, one older, guiding the younger with advice, teaching her how to demand payment first, how to avoid certain alleys, how to spot danger, passing down survival as though it were inheritance. And in this transmission of knowledge, we glimpse a lineage of resilience, a wisdom born from hardship yet shared freely, a reminder that even among those called fallen, there was the strength of teachers, guardians, protectors. And though society tried to reduce these women to symbols of sin, in truth they were builders of communities, architects of fragile sanctuaries that history has too often ignored. And in listening to them now, softly, we restore some of what was denied, recognizing not only their suffering, but their strengths. So as your breath steadies and your eyelids grow heavy, let this image carry you, the teapot steaming in a cramped room, the laughter rising above hardship, the quiet kindness of women who stood together against the world's judgment, and allow your curiosity to drift forward. For in the next part, we will step into the twilight years of these lives, exploring what happened when women grew older, when beauty and youth no longer drew clients, when the fragile economy of survival slipped away, and how society treated those who had given their best years to a trade it both consumed and condemned. A chapter at once heartbreaking and necessary, waiting in the quiet shadows ahead. If youth and beauty offered a fragile currency in the streets and brothels of Victorian England, the passing of time stripped that currency away. And for many prostitutes, the twilight years were not years of rest, but of abandonment. For once a woman's body no longer drew clients, she discovered how little society had ever valued her beyond her capacity to serve. And though novels and sermons ended the stories of fallen women with either tragic death or sudden redemption, the truth is that most simply aged into invisibility, their lives continuing in obscurity long after the world had stopped noticing. Imagine a woman of 40, once lively under the lamps of Haymarket, now standing in the shadows of Whitechapel, her face lined, her hair graying, clients passing her by in search of younger figures. The coins that once trickled in now dwindling, and with them her ability to pay rent, to buy bread, to survive, until she drifts toward the workhouse, that dreaded last resort of the destitute, where prostitutes were confined alongside paupers, their identities reduced to numbers and registers, their years of survival forgotten in the shuffle of poverty. Some managed to find small refuges, charitable homes that took in older women, or friendships that endured into age, where companions cared for one another in illness, but many more slipped quietly into death, buried in common graves, their names absent from stone, their lives remembered only in the margins of police reports or hospital records. And it is here in the silence of their endings that the cruelty of Victorian hypocrisy is most visible. For a society that consumed their labor and condemned their existence offered nothing when age made them unprofitable, treating them as if their humanity had expired with their youth. Yet even in this bleakness, small sparks of resilience flickered, for some women reinvented themselves as lodging keepers, tavern workers, or midwives, carving new roles from the fragments of their old lives, passing down hard-earned wisdom to younger women, warning them of dangers, teaching them tricks of survival, creating a legacy of experience, even as society ignored them. Others turned to petty trade, selling matches or flowers in the streets, their figures hunched, but their voices still carrying laughter or sharp wit, reminding us that even in age, they retained their spirit, their ability to endure with dignity, the scorn that never left them. And there were still stranger paths too, with some women marrying late in life, finding partners among the poor or widowed, building modest households that allowed them at last to step away from the streets. And though such stories were rare, they revealed that even in the twilight years, possibility had not entirely vanished. But most often the fate was harsh. And reformers who visited the slums described the sight of old women huddled in doorways, shawls threadbare, their voices roughened by years of shouting into the night, eyes dulled by gin and exhaustion. And it is in these images that we see how society discarded them, stripping away not only their livelihood, but also their memory, ensuring that their lives would vanish without recognition. And yet here, in the telling, we may restore some of that memory, for to speak of their twilight years is to give dignity to what history erased, to acknowledge that even when forgotten, these women carried the same longing, the same tenderness, the same spark of humanity as in their youth. So as you rest now, let your mind linger on the image of an older woman sitting by a window in a lodging house, watching fog curl along the rooftops, her body tired, but her heart still remembering laughter shared long ago, friendships small, joys, fleeting loves, and let that image remind you that even in obscurity, life carried meaning, even when unrecorded. And as your breath deepens and your eyes grow heavier, allow curiosity to pull you onward into the next part, where we will turn to the broader city once more, exploring how the very architecture of Victorian London, the streets, the alleys, the rookeries, the slum shaped, and was shaped by prostitution, revealing how space itself became both prison and stage. A chapter that lets us wander slowly through the map of a city, whose stones still whisper of the lives lived upon them. And so, as the long shadows of this history stretch towards silence, we are left not with numbers or laws, but with the lingering presence of women whose footsteps once echoed through the alleys of Victorian London, whose laughter and tears threaded through the gaslit nights, and whose resilience remains even now a quiet defiance against the scorn of their age. Picture the city as dawn breaks, the fog thinning over cobblestones slick with rain, shopkeepers unlocking their doors, carriages rattling into motion, and in the midst of this morning rhythm, a few women returning to their lodgings, eyes heavy with exhaustion, shawls pulled close, their earnings already claimed by rent, by hunger, by debts, yet still walking, still enduring, their existence as real and as human as the grandeur of Parliament or the spires of St. Paul's. History tried to call them fallen, yet what falls more deeply than a society that abandons its own? And what rises more clearly than the human will to survive even in the face of abandonment? In their friendships, in their small rituals, in their laughter shared over cheap tea, in their care for one another when sickness or violence struck. They built something more lasting than the myths that condemned them. They built fragile communities of endurance that refused to vanish even when the world pretended not to see. And though their names are mostly gone, their presence remains in the very bones of the city, in the narrow lanes of Whitechapel, in the stones of Covent Garden, in the vanished rookeries where they lived and died. And if you walk there now, you may feel the faint echo of their lives beneath your own steps, as though the cobblestones themselves remember. Perhaps this is the final truth, that the story of prostitution in Victorian England is not only about sin or survival, not only about hypocrisy or law, but about humanity itself, about the ways people create meaning even when stripped of dignity, about the strength that persists in laughter, in kindness, in the refusal to be erased. And as your eyes grow heavy now, as sleep draws near, let that truth rest gently within you, that no matter how harsh the judgments of history, the quiet resilience of those forgotten women remains, whispering still through the silence, reminding us to listen, to see, to remember. Perhaps your breathing has slowed, your body settled, your mind hovering between wakefulness and dream. And that is fitting, for these stories were always meant to drift into the night like a candle's glow, leaving not disturbance but calm, reflection, not outrage, but a deeper softness toward the hidden lives of others. So close your eyes. Let the fog of Victorian London fade into darkness. Let the echo of footsteps dissolve into quiet, and carry with you only this, that in every forgotten corner of history, there is endurance, there is humanity, and there is always something worth remembering.